Welcome to the Christopher Peter Review. My name is Christopher Peter and I am the political economist behind the Christopher Peter Review podcast and blog. I started the Christopher Peter Review to provide an economic perspective while discussing salient current events that impact our public policy, economic outcomes, and overall society. As a political economist, my focus is identifying solutions that provide the maximum amount of benefit for the greatest number of people, while considering our political and economic systems and social traditions. In our content, we focus on ideas to help make our nation and world a better, more prosperous, and safer place while protecting strongly held principles of freedom, democracy, free markets and diversity. Each week you will find a featured podcast episode posted to this site. Please enjoy this episode, and when you are ready for more content, please click on the image above to visit the full Christopher Peter Review site. I thank you in advance for your viewership and hope. My name is Christopher Peter and welcome to my podcast, the Christopher Peter Podcast. My focus is to provide common sense but analytical commentary on critical issues and events that directly impact the effectiveness of our public policy, outcomes in our economy, and the quality of life in our society. The original content here will always center on the facts, evidence, and data, not political hysteria or partisanship. In my last podcast, Citizens Not Subjects, I discussed the need to embrace freedom and the responsibilities that come with freedom. There is no acceptable alternative to freedom, democracy, or free markets. The alternative is oppression, tyranny, and poverty. None of these options are acceptable. It is important to build off this theme and further our discussion by looking into the importance of community as the fabric of our society. Not in the sense of a collection of people defined by demographics, but an American community regardless of our superficial traits. Our society needs to restore a sense of community, which can help fix some of the division and other issues we face daily. Let us begin. Community traditionally serves as the fabric of our society, but that fabric has experienced many tears in it lately. Ideally, every American would live in a safe community, where people can safely raise their families, work, run a business, or simply live in peace. Ideally, every American would live in a community that is clean. But we all know that is not a reality for many Americans. Many communities are growing unsafe to live in. Many communities are plagued with leaders who are simply not competent enough to provide basic government services like public education. Many of our large cities foster communities resembling third world conditions rather than what we expect to see in America. If we genuinely want to restore American greatness or build back better, we need to restore our communities. Not just the bricks and mortars of buildings, but the intangible purpose community contributes to our society. When I visit my hometown, I barely remember it as it hardly resembles the one I grew up in. Many of us left and so did our families. Many of the households who left were not replaced with new residents, leaving homes empty and abandoned. I am not mentioning this to point out the deterioration. Economic shifts, public policy, and other factors impact local outcomes. Some towns diminish during certain periods then revitalize in later periods. The economic shifts are not as important as the interconnection that used to define our communities and protected them from harm because of a general sense of shared responsibility. Even in the most affluent communities, there is still a disconnect among the people that traditionally does not exist in what one considers a true community. There is a saying that it takes a village to raise a child. Reflecting the need for communities to serve as an extension of the family to some degree. Many of us knew the people in our community serving as an extra set of eyes and ears relaying information back to our parents if we stepped too far out of line. In an era when kids played outside without the carefully planned play dates. Nowadays, people go out of their way to avoid direct interactions with others. Many people try to avoid even the most basic gestures of kindness. I will admit, I am guilty of this. I try to avoid small talk at all costs. But this disconnect has consequences. The interconnection traditionally found in our communities prevents crime. People are hesitant to do something that may negatively impact a family member, friend, or person in their sphere of connection. You are less likely to litter if you know the owner of the property. Less likely to damage something if you know the impacted party. As people move more frequently and neighborhoods change, there is a level of anonymity that affords people of low moral standing to behave in a manner not in line with acceptable societal standards. Now, changes are not the only reason our community fabric is torn. Not the only reason many places are seeing higher crime rates across the board. Public policy approaches that relax our value system contributes to the deterioration we see in many areas. Also, the practice of normalizing immoral behavior and habits compounds our problems. Detaching the bad actors from their immoral behavior promotes more immoral behavior. Some in our society do not want to see people who violate standards of what is acceptable social norms be held accountable even when their behaviors harm others. People who consider themselves progressive liberals commonly argue for protections of criminal actors without any regard to the impact on the true victims of those crimes. There is really no such thing as victimless crime. Some argue that certain crimes are not really crimes, which can be agreeable to some degree. There are some laws and policies that punish people unfairly or are inconsistent. For instance, cities like New York, where they protect people who violate our immigration laws but punish those who reject a voluntary vaccine. Not consistent in approach. There is a need to see what the impact of the action is, and if the impact is beyond the actor, then accountability is appropriate. Violating laws just because it was not a law before is not an excuse. Laws change and people should follow the laws in place or advocate for change. To protect our communities, people should understand why they need to avoid being part of the problem even if they choose not to be part of the solution. While I passionately believe in and support individualism, there is a need to have a basic responsibility to the community. Do not litter, deface, or destroy property or land in your communities if you wish to keep it nice and attractive for investment and development. It is not just the responsibility of local leaders to upkeep the community, but the residents living there. Going back to my hometown, people took pride in keeping their neighborhoods free of garbage and debris when I was growing up. There were no street sweepers. Now, people litter without regard to the people in the area. Yet, the same litterbugs will complain about the conditions of their neighborhoods. If we want to restore our greatness or build back better, we need to elevate our values and standards to restore our sense of community. The question is how? What changes do we make in order to shift our direction? Part of the responsibility is with our public policy. Part is with the people. Our public policy needs to hold people accountable for their actions and connect some level of restitution when people do not live up to standards. While not every infraction should require a prison sentence, financial penalties or loss of public benefits might serve as real justice or a deterrent. Should we provide public benefits to people that violate the public's trust and conditions? Probably not. Communities cannot be weak on crime. Effective leaders can balance compassion, fairness, and accountability to ensure everyone lives up to shared norms of behaviors. For the people, our value systems need to change and our adherence to our espoused values need to be stronger. Many of us, including myself, make the mistake of sometimes holding others to a standard while exempting ourselves from it. That needs to change. We all need to be better contributors to our communities. Even if we are not actively participating in the solution, we can still avoid being part of the problem. We can choose to stop with pointless divisive behaviors and instead seek to help others in need. Even if it is simply a small gesture of kindness. Restoring our sense of community can do wonders for our society. Another part of society that provides a community structure, good or bad, is social media. There are few things in life that are all good or all bad. Many times, we need to find ways to accentuate the good while mitigating the bad. Social media has enormous potential for both good and bad in our society. The positive aspect of social media is the ability to facilitate communication across different spheres of society as well as effortlessly maintain social networks to some degree. Social media companies aim to foster engagement and dialogue across the world. Across diverse groups that may normally not exchange dialogue. People in power could see in real time the views of the average person. Keep in mind, social media is far from a representative overview of society as a whole. Many social media channels can be fringe views just shared repeatedly, making appear more prevalent than it really is. The more we learn about behaviors of users and how tech companies operate the platform, we find out that there is somewhat of an effort to elevate voices of the fringe left while suppressing the right. In 2009, social media use was widely praised for helping place President Barack Obama in office, who used social media to connect with voters. In 2016, social media was denounced because President Donald Trump connected with disgruntled Republicans and Democrats to forge a path to office. In 2020, left-of-center politicians view social media as a threat largely because it offers the public a voice. A person with a platform and opinion is always a threat to power in the mind of autocrats. Our society is built on the premise of free speech. A right our fellow Americans on the left use to excuse their offensive behavior while denying it to their opponents. Ironically, both politicians on the left and right want greater regulation on social media, and both sides view it as a potential danger to society. For varied reasons. For the political right, social media companies are viewed as public censors that skew national conversations with clear and obvious bias and harm free speech. For the political left, social media companies do not censor speech enough to prevent the public from hearing opposing points of view or speech the left deems as dangerous. There is unmistakable evidence that social media companies operate with great ideological bias and are not removing threats or clear and obvious misinformation. especially if the misinformation is coming from the left. Many social media companies want to portray that their platforms provide fair and equal access and treatment, but we now know that is not the case. Some high-profile users are treated as VIPs and are not subject to the same level of scrutiny. Some defend social media companies' behaviors under the guise of they are a private company. But they are impacting national elections, therefore opening the door for regulation. The question is what kind of regulation and how to enforce it. An issue with regulation is that this avenue is a way the government can directly censor political opponents of the party in power. Deeming points of view that you oppose as dangerous simply because you disagree is censorship, not protection of society. There is a great level of content suppressed related to the pandemic that is turning out to be true, and social media companies backtrack to change the censoring of these topics. For instance, many companies censored any material placing blame on the origin of the virus on anything other than eating bats. Well, it is more reasonable that it could be a mistaken lab leak than people eating bats. Neither one proved right or wrong to this point. Both speculations. But supposed fact-checkers decided that eating bats was the only acceptable point of view. Inappropriate censorship. The question is which direction to go. I believe society should not think so lowly of its citizens to believe people are unable to tell the difference between clear misinformation and alternate points of view. People are able to separate fact from fiction. Even though there are clearly people that struggle, there are always going to be people with some level of gullibility. The appropriate counter to speech you disagree with is more speech. Many on the political left operate with a deep sense of entitlement. They believe others should just accept their views because they say so. Notice many of their counter speeches are illogical personal attacks without any substantive facts, evidence, and data. That is usually the case with the fringe. Society should not censor speech. Direct threats, obvious bullying, or blatant lies like Russia stole the election are inappropriate uses of social media. There need to be clear and consistent standards. Consistent is an important word in consistent standards. Also, not all people are able to strike a healthy balance with social media. Some minors lack perspective on social media, growing up with the platforms being a normal part of their life. As a result, social media interactions can have a toxic impact on minors who place too great of importance on likes, shares, and other pointless measures of social media fame. There may need to be some guidelines to help parents strike a healthy balance of how their children should use the platforms. For many, social media is just a manner to communicate, be entertained, or keep up with the social network, both near and far. Many people filter out the nonsense or block the crazies. Many of us lived in a world prior to social media, understanding what is real and important and when to turn off social media. There are many benefits to social media, but people need to use it properly and maintain a proper perspective. There is a need to regulate social media to ensure tech companies are not manipulating the flow of information to promote biased social views. At this point, social media is like a public utility because of the wide use as well as the commercial application in marketing and brand awareness. Applying the same standards traditional news media operate under and providing oversight to allow users who are unfairly impacted by these companies an avenue of relief is appropriate. Social media does benefit society, but there are obvious drawbacks. We must not allow these companies to censor society to appease autocrats in our government. Protect free speech, but also protect the gullible in our society to a degree. The best counter to speech you disagree with is counter speech with facts, evidence, and data. Social media companies must value free speech and avoid censorship. Proper regulations and perspective can help social media's positive aspect be a good for society and our community. Our communities and overall society are impacted by poor choices by our leaders. There is no denying that America is not heading in the right direction. Our economy is in a challenging position with inflation still present. Supply chain issues impacting retailers, producers, and healthcare providers. Employment numbers are quite troubling, and many Americans are not actively looking for work. Government spending is having a negative impact on our economic outcomes, and the projected public policy out of the current administration appears to be set to double down on this disaster. Now, the Biden administration has oversaw more American COVID deaths than what occurred during the Trump era, despite coming into office with 3 vaccines available. An unfortunate cherry on top is that our recent major foreign policy flaw with the Afghanistan withdrawal will not help our reputation on the world stage. Our allies will have trouble trusting this administration. A sentiment many Americans share. Biden claimed the adults are in office and that he was competent to handle the challenges of our time, despite the clear and obvious evidence that his mental condition is much diminished. We also know from his military advisors that Joe Biden did not follow their recommendations. The flawed plan that restored the Taliban to power, stranded many Americans and our allies, and embarrassed our society was an overrule by a president with the least qualifications to make an overrule. Much was made about the perception that former President Donald Trump did not listen to intelligence officials at times. But Trump had the right gut instincts to hold our enemies at bay and keep our allies accountable to their commitments. Challenging but the right approach. Biden has dropped the ball in every major policy area since coming to office. Remember him declaring America back on the world stage, and then this happened. Outcomes matter much more than words. What an elected official actually does and the impact of their policies, ideas, and leadership is much more important. Biden, like many in his party, hoped that the Democratic-friendly traditional media and social media will cover for his flaw. But it seems like even the most biased journalist cannot completely talk away what is a clear and obvious failure. The general public knows this. America is heading towards a recession, yet the administration is worried more about raising the cost of living to fund their pet projects. Focusing more on sowing division and scaling back national security to appease the fringe of their party. Not the direction any rational American wants to see the nation we all love head. Think about that. Coming into office with 3 proven and effective vaccines and still saw more people die than when there were no viable vaccines. He claimed all the previous deaths were preventable. The deaths under his watch were even more preventable. But what about the vaccine hesitation? Much of that was influenced by his ticket on the campaign trail. How many times did Biden and Kamala Harris make claims that fostered doubt about the vaccines? Harris frequently stated she would trust the vaccine. Of course, it depended on the outcome of the election, despite the vaccines being a private endeavor. Biden and Harris wanted Americans to trust the vaccines if they won and not if they lost. Again, the vaccines were a private endeavor by companies with a history of making proven and effective vaccines. They are safe and effective regardless of the political party. The many failures of Joe Biden should have voters rethinking their positions. We are headed in the wrong direction because people made the wrong choice. Finally, let us talk about choices. Life is all about choices. In every situation, there always is a choice. One of the hardest things we have to do in life is to be honest with ourselves. Look in the mirror and hold ourselves accountable for our current state and the choices we made that led to either the desired or undesirable outcome. The hard reality in our world that many people do not want to acknowledge is that we are a direct product of our decisions, choices, and value systems. We can separate our outcomes and situations from our actions and choices. While there are factors outside of our control at times, we choose how to respond. We choose to persevere. Choose to overcome. Choose to continue to fight adversity. Choose to give up. Even in challenging situations where you feel that everything is happening outside of your direct control, you can accept the responsibility to change direction to end heading down the wrong path. The reality of life is that success cannot be achieved in the absence of personal responsibility. In a society that wants us to outsource blame to others, we need to instead choose to accept responsibility for our situations and accept the responsibility to make changes needed for a different outcome. Decide to make better decisions that lead to better outcomes. Do not blame those in the community who are successful for your outcomes. Attempt to reach out for guidance on how to best position yourself for the success you seek. In closing, I thank you for experiencing my content and my channel. Hope that you will continue to view the latest content as it becomes available. Until next time. The Christopher Peter Review provides original podcasts and common sense commentary focused on salient current events impacting our public policy, economic outcomes, and overall society. Please experience our content by visiting www.crcreview.com. Thank you. Welcome to the Christopher Peter Review. My name is Christopher Peter and it is my pleasure to introduce you to the podcast that will serve as your source for common sense analytical commentary on salient current events impacting our public policy, economic outcomes, and overall society. Our objective is to provide ideas and analysis to help make our society a better place to live, work, and thrive in. I will be completely open and honest and start off our discussion by stating that I prefer to live outside the confines of cities. I do appreciate what city life has to offer, experiencing it in both Philly and New York, but it is not my personal choice. But, I do enjoy visiting cities, experiencing the food, art, sports, and entertainment that takes place in cities. Just prefer to avoid the traffic, congestion, smells, and people of the city. Whether you prefer the thrills of city life or the quiet and comfort of suburban or rural life, you have to understand the importance cities play in our overall society. Typically, cities serve as a hub of economic activity, providing a central location for commerce, employment, or meeting stakeholders. Cities are hubs for innovation, collaboration, and celebrating. While I prefer to enjoy the benefits of the city and then retreat to more peaceful locations, I appreciate the importance of what our great cities offer our society. And we are blessed with many cities, each with their own unique appeal and identity. I personally feel like there is no better sports city than Philadelphia, with its big city feel combined with a historic connection to our very founding. I do like the abundance available in New York City, with its 5 boroughs all different. Another great historic city in Boston, with great food places and sights to see. And who does not appreciate visiting D.C., the power hub of the greatest nation in the world? Chicago gets a bad reputation at times, but it truly has an interesting appeal to it. If you enjoy wind and everything costing more than it should, you get that in New York as well. But Chicago deep dish is really good pizza. Especially when you get it in Chicago. But nothing beats a cheesesteak while watching an Eagles, Phillies, Sixers, or Flyers game.
My name is Jennifer and welcome. I think we cannot leave out our great cities on the West Coast or the South. Los Angeles, the city of stars, Hollywood, and the laid-back lifestyle. Cannot ignore San Francisco, the city at the center of the tech industry and innovation with its beauty. We should ignore cities like Dallas, Houston, or Phoenix. Or ignore ones like Atlanta, Miami, or Charlotte, which is a very interesting one you visited recently. Each of our big cities have something that is unique, good, and worth experiencing. But I am more of a city person than you are. I believe there are the conveniences many people take for granted in the city, like enjoying public transportation, nightlife, restaurants, and random events that are unexpected and interesting. But everyone has a different preferred lifestyle. Some people prefer to drive versus ride a bus or train. More people seem to prefer cooking for themselves than eat out to control health or diet concerns. And to each their own. That is the beauty of America, is being able to live in the manner of your choosing and having the freedom to do so. And, yes, there is nothing like a cheesesteak during game day.
Does anyone truly enjoy public transportation, especially the subways in many of our cities? Especially now after the pandemic, I think it is changing what some are willing to tolerate. People tolerate it because that is a reality of their life at the moment. That is why so many people fought hard to avoid returning to the office. Because the commute is really the most inconvenient and abhorrent part of their work life, which they only tolerated because of the income. What seems to be happening in our cities that people do not want to tolerate anymore is the growing problems with rising crime, expanding homelessness, and declining quality of services provided by local governments. Many of our large big cities are seeing people fleeing for more optimal locations. Safer communities, better or more consistent school systems, and cleaner environments. Many metropolitan areas are seeing tens of thousands of people heading outside their city limits. For those who are unable to flee, they will be stuck with the cost and burden that is left behind. May not be felt immediately, but over time.
Well, let's start with the issue of the rising crime. Cities will have higher total crime than other areas in general. There are more people per square mile. So there are more opportunities for crime. The greater the population density, there will be more conflicts because more interactions with people and also competing for the same resources, same opportunities, or even the same spot in traffic. Also, the communities are less connected overall as in a town or suburb. I believe city people feel more anonymous to some degree, which may make them feel less likely to be held accountable for what they may deem as petty crime. In a smaller community, your reputation may be more readily known because everyone knows your name or family. Word travels fast in smaller communities.
Does anyone truly enjoy public transportation, especially the subways in many of our cities? Especially now after the pandemic, I think it is changing what some are willing to tolerate. People tolerate it because that is a reality of their life at the moment. That is why so many people fought hard to avoid returning to the office. Because the commute is really the most inconvenient and abhorrent part of their work life, which they only tolerated because of the income. What seems to be happening in our cities that people do not want to tolerate anymore is the growing problems with rising crime, expanding homelessness, and declining quality of services provided by local governments. Many of our large big cities are seeing people fleeing for more optimal locations. Safer communities, better or more consistent school systems, and cleaner environments. Many metropolitan areas are seeing tens of thousands of people heading outside their city limits. For those who are unable to flee, they will be stuck with the cost and burden that is left behind. May not be felt immediately, but over time.
We talk about it here quite a bit about the need to balance the need to ensure fair and appropriate practices in our justice system with the need for law and order. And you can have both if there is competent leadership in place. Leaders that do not place the comforts of criminals above the interest of the innocent. Police are tasked with dealing with the worst in our society at times or people at their worst moment in life. They have a difficult and dangerous job. But they chose a career in this profession and have the responsibility to apprehend suspects and afford them their due process. Instead of bowing to radicals who call for no policing, leaders should actually call for more police, reducing the burden on each officer. And implement better training, standard procedures, and accountability. There are areas of opportunities to reduce biases, but not use quotas that allow criminals to remain free. If you commit a crime and enough evidence is available to justify an arrest and probable cause, then that person needs to be arrested and have their day in court.
I do agree that the whole reputation and word-of-mouth aspect in smaller populations impacts crime. You will be less likely to do something bad if you know it follows you wherever you go. Recall also that Philadelphia District Attorney Larry Krasner attempted to deflect criticism of his record by saying Philadelphia has less crime than red state areas. He did not include the fact that higher population areas may have less percentage crime because more people dilute the statistic. As much as facts and data are important, it is important to understand the need to match the data type to the situation. Also to the related policy that may impact the data. For instance, the policies enacted to not prosecute crimes will make crime appear lower, when in reality is misleading. When you choose to alter the way crime is reported also can make it appear like less crime is being done. For example, if you classify a mass shooting as one murder with multiple victims rather than one murder for each of the victims, then it appears like there is less crime. Even with data manipulation, crime is on the rise and people are no longer comfortable looking the other way. They are having to make the tough decisions to vacate communities they grew up in or relocate businesses away from customers to avoid those who wish harm and chaos.
Projecting potential changes that may prove catastrophic is not easy when one is not willing to acknowledge there is a problem to begin with. In many of our large cities, we saw many local leaders unwilling to acknowledge issues driving people and businesses out of their city limits until it was already well underway. Still then many of them chose to question the economic patriotism of those fleeing, like people have to be willing victims to the poorly functioning policies they no longer believe is beneficial to them. Rather, the burden should be on those elected to maintain a community people are willing to live in, raise their families in, and work in. And that always starts with the quality of the economy. Areas with productive economies will have less crime and more resources to discourage it. Areas with good economies are going to better create cycles of success and not dependency. Everything in society comes down to the economy. Otherwise, people will either flee or choose to make ends meet by any means possible, which is not ideal.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. People automatically shift towards one pole or the other. Either they think police can do no wrong or the criminal is an innocent victim who was out of the blue accosted by law enforcement. When these situations typically have wrongs on both sides. But crime is not the only major issue cities face. And crime is also a direct result of the problem with declining economic stability in many cities and economic disparities that are prone in the city environment. Although cities are hubs for economic activity, traditionally, times have changed and technology allows for economic activity to happen almost anywhere. Also, the entrepreneurs and investor class tend to prefer to not reside in certain cities because of the quality of life. Most people with the ability to live outside of the city will make that choice. And history has shown the massive migration out of certain cities has negatively impacted economic outcomes even to this day. Some cities are better able to adapt. Others not so much. But, when you have people leave, businesses leave, what is left behind? People who are unable to flee who are left to foot the bill and without opportunities readily available to enable them to do so. The infrastructure of a city is not readily adjustable to population or industrial shifts. One can easily understand how cities can go from growth to budget constraints pretty quick if policymakers are unable to reasonably project changes.
A growing economy that is diverse and dynamic also provides numerous value channels that afford local governments the resources needed to maintain or improve government services. Another problem in many of these cities is the declining quality of public services. There was a time when New York City had a strong public education system that generated talent beyond its borders. But, now the education quality is greatly inconsistent to the point that you really need to find a quality private or charter school to ensure your child has a competitive education. Consider the fact that many of the workers in high-paying service roles are imported from other states or from overseas. In many communities, infrastructure is not well maintained and services are highly inconsistent. So why would someone remain in an environment plagued by a high cost of living and with poor public services? You are not getting what you pay for.
In all fairness, there are many reasons why policymakers are slow to address these issues. There are lags in when these arise and when they become noticeable to the point where action is needed. Many local leaders are beholden to the status quo and focus more on their electability before doing anything that could impact their political machines. For instance, many of these impacted communities saw union jobs flee overseas, and many local leaders are reliant on union votes and funding. It is hard to enact any policy changes that make local labor markets more competitive until it is too late. I do believe that we need pro-growth politicians because a growing economy can provide opportunities for those in unions as well as those who prefer to be in non-union work, self-employment, or entrepreneurship.
Since you do not prefer the city life, you are less likely to be drawn to reside in a city. But, I do think that if our great cities focus on creating environments that encourage economic growth, investment, and employment, then people might return. But, they must restore law and order so people feel safe relocate their families and businesses in these communities. Otherwise, the economic appeal is simply not enough. They also need to ensure the government services are effective and consistent. Tasks that must be done simultaneously in order to really make our cities great again.
As we prepare for the conversation segment, let us experience our new segment from the rest of the CRC team. Thank you for experiencing this presentation of the Christopher Peter Review. Please continue to visit us at www.crcrvw.com for new content and explore the content channels available. Thank you once again for experiencing this podcast episode, and we will see you next time.